modern superheroes.
Pavel Belomestnykh grew up in a modest town on the outskirts of Russia, in a community where opportunities felt limited and the wider world seemed like a distant dream. As a child, Pavel's curiosity was boundless. While others around him accepted their routines, Pavel looked beyond, hungry for knowledge and driven by a sense of purpose. He devoured books, watched documentaries, and dreamed of a future where he could transcend the limitations of his small town. To Pavel, the world outside Russia represented hope and progress. He was fascinated by places where innovation thrived, where people could freely pursue knowledge and opportunity. One country stood out to him in particular: Canada. Pavel had read about Canada's educational system, its cultural openness, and its encouragement of critical thinking. To him, it was a place where he could grow intellectually, where his ideas could be shaped by diverse influences, and where he could find the freedom to forge his own path. For years, he prepared for the journey, learning English on his own and navigating the complex application process. Finally, he earned a scholarship to study abroad, a ticket to the life he had always imagined. Arriving in Canada was like stepping into a new world, one filled with possibilities that seemed endless. Pavel found himself in a place that was everything he'd hoped for: a society where hard work was valued, where people were encouraged to explore new ideas, and where he felt he could finally achieve something truly meaningful. Pavel dove into his studies with unparalleled enthusiasm. He majored in business and economics, fields he believed would enable him to bridge the gap between Russia and the West. In Canada, he learned not just about theory, but also about the mechanisms of a society driven by freedom and accountability. He was inspired by the democratic ideals around him and the opportunities available to those willing to work for them. Pavel began to see himself as a future bridge between East and West, someone who could contribute to a new, collaborative relationship between Russia and the world. During his years in Canada, Pavel embraced every opportunity. He attended conferences, connected with influential professors, and even joined international student groups, all the while deepening his understanding of Western culture and values. For the first time, Pavel felt a sense of true purpose, a belief that he could use his education not only to secure his own future, but to make a positive impact in Russia. But as graduation approached, he felt a growing pull to return to his homeland. He was filled with a sense of responsibility, a desire to give back, and to help create change within Russia. And so, with a heavy but hopeful heart, Pavel made the decision to leave Canada and return to Russia. The parting was bittersweet. He left behind friends, mentors, and a lifestyle that had opened his eyes to new possibilities. Yet he believed he could bring back everything he had learned and use it to make a difference. Pavel dreamed of building a future in Russia, contributing to its economy and fostering connections with the Western world. He saw himself as part of a new wave of young Russians, equipped with knowledge from abroad, ready to uplift their country. But almost as soon as he arrived, Pavel sensed a tension he couldn't quite explain. The Russia he had returned to seemed different, colder, and somehow more watchful. People were polite, yet guarded. Friends and family welcomed him back, but he felt their subtle, wary glances when he spoke too openly about his time in Canada. It was as if his Western education had marked him, made him an outsider among his own people. He tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to post-travel adjustment or paranoia. But soon, the feeling grew stronger. Strangers approached him in the guise of helpful locals, offering guidance, assistance, and advice on adapting to life back in Russia. At first, he thought of them as kind gestures, part of the country's famous hospitality. But he began to notice patterns. One acquaintance helped him bypass bureaucratic obstacles with a simple phone call. Another provided leads on jobs Pavel hadn't even applied for. These interactions, once comforting, started to feel orchestrated, as if someone were placing people in his path to steer him in a particular direction. Pavel couldn't have known it then, but the Federal Security Service, the FSB, had already set its sights on him. To them, Pavel represented more than just a young man returning home. He was a valuable resource, someone who could bridge Russian and Western worlds, and someone with knowledge that could be turned to Moscow's advantage. The FSB saw Pavel as a tool, a potential asset whose connections to the West and understanding of North American systems could serve a greater agenda. The FSB didn't approach him openly. They didn't need to. Instead, they worked subtly, embedding people around him who could keep him in line, offer small but binding favors, and monitor his every move. They observed his interactions, evaluated his conversations, and took note of the values he held from his time in Canada. They wanted to know if he was loyal, if he could be trusted, or, if needed, controlled. Pavel was unaware of the shadow over him. In his mind, he was simply reconnecting with his homeland, eager to apply his education and experience to foster change. He spoke of his ideals with enthusiasm, shared insights from his time in Canada, and openly expressed his belief in a collaborative relationship between East and West. But with each conversation, each interaction, the FSB took note. They saw in him not just a young man, but a potential threat, a target, and a pawn to be shaped according to their will. For now, Pavel was optimistic, still holding on to his dreams of a better Russia, one that could learn from the West and grow stronger through partnership. But he had unwittingly stepped into a world where personal ambition was dangerous, where hope was seen as a weakness, and where ideals could be weaponized. The FSB had plans for him, plans he couldn't yet see. This was only the beginning of Pavel's journey. He thought he had returned to Russia to help build a brighter future. But he was about to find himself caught in a game of control and power far beyond his imagination. His story would take him into the heart of a shadow network, where the rules were written by forces that saw people not as individuals, but as instruments in a vast, dark design. Pavel was ready to give his all for Russia, but the Russia waiting for him was not the one he'd hoped to find. Pavel had returned to Russia with high hopes, but unknown to him, he had also returned with something else, the attention of one of the most powerful and secretive intelligence agencies in the world. For the FSB, Pavel was no ordinary returnee. To them, he represented an ideal recruit, someone with intimate knowledge of the West, fluency in English, and connections to North America's academic and business circles. It was rare for a young Russian to possess such an extensive understanding of Western society. And to the FSB, these qualities made Pavel more than just an asset. He was a potential doorway to a new realm of influence. The FSB's interest in Pavel began quietly, with agents watching him from a distance, gathering pieces of information that would paint a profile. They noted his connections, his ideals, even his casual conversations with family and friends. He didn't realize it, but almost everything he did was being observed. The FSB wanted to understand him, not just his skills, but his personality, his weaknesses, fears. For Pavel, everyday life resumed as normal, but for the FSB, it was the start of a subtle campaign of control. At first, their interest was benign. A distant relative he hadn't heard from in years suddenly reconnected, reaching out to catch up. A family friend mentioned knowing people in government who could help him find work. These small gestures seemed innocent enough, but each of them was part of a larger plan. Each connection was carefully chosen. Each person briefed on how to steer Pavel toward the agency's interests without him noticing. As time went on, Pavel found himself surrounded by friends who seemed remarkably well connected. They helped him get settled, offered him insider advice on navigating the complexities of Russian bureaucracy, and, when he needed it, even extended favors to smooth out certain difficulties. In a place like Russia, where connections could mean the difference between success and stagnation, these favors were hard to refuse. And that was precisely the point. The FSB knew that loyalty in Russia often began with favors. Each small act of assistance came with an unspoken price, the formation of an unbreakable bond, a sense of indebtedness that could be subtly leveraged over time. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Pavel felt himself drawn into their orbit. People around him were eager to help, to offer advice, to listen to his experiences in Canada. But Pavel noticed that these encounters often had a similar structure, a series of probing questions, each one building on the last, a quiet attempt to uncover his deeper thoughts and values. As Pavel shared stories about life in North America, he could sense a subtle tension in his listeners' responses. Sometimes they would seem overly interested in his perspectives on Western freedoms or democratic values. Other times, they'd ask for specific details about how certain aspects of Canadian life worked. Questions about politics, law enforcement, education. These weren't just the curiosities of casual conversation. They were calculated probes, questions designed to reveal how much Pavel knew and how useful that knowledge could be. It didn't take long for Pavel to realize that he was under some kind of silent surveillance. He noticed the same faces appearing in unexpected places, people he had met once suddenly reappearing as though by coincidence. Calls would come at odd times, asking innocuous questions about his plans or his whereabouts. He began to feel as though he was being shepherded, guided by invisible hands toward a future he hadn't chosen. The friendly faces, the helping hands, all of them were part of a carefully constructed web designed to bind him to the agency's will. But the FSB's tactics went beyond mere observation. They began to manipulate his environment in more direct ways, offering him opportunities that seemed almost too perfect. A lucrative job offer came his way through a friend of a friend, an impressive role in an international business that seemed tailored to his skill set. Pavel, eager to make a difference and put his education to use, accepted without hesitation. It was only later that he would realize this position came with strings attached. The FSB had subtly woven themselves into his career, ensuring that his success, and by extension his loyalty, was tied to them. The psychological pressure was relentless but invisible. The FSB used what they had learned about Pavel to play on his deepest fears and insecurities. They would drop subtle hints, reminders that his family was nearby, that they were proud of his work, that they hoped he would continue to honor his country. These words, innocuous on the surface, carried an underlying message. His family's safety, his future, all depended on his cooperation. And with each reminder, Pavel felt the tightening grip of a force he could neither see nor resist. It became clear to Pavel that these connections weren't simply friendly gestures. The FSB operatives around him were more like handlers, each with a specific role in guiding his decisions and influencing his beliefs. They introduced him to influential figures, people with deep ties to the government, who subtly reinforced the idea that Russia's interests were paramount, and that Pavel's Western ideals were naive, a product of a culture that didn't understand the realities of Russian life. But Pavel was also beginning to understand the true nature of the FSB's interest in him. He realized that his connections to North America, his fluency in English, his first-hand knowledge of Western systems, all of these were assets the FSB wanted to exploit. They weren't interested in his ambitions, his dreams, or his desire to help Russia grow. They wanted a bridge to the West, someone who could be their eyes and ears in a world they sought to influence and, if necessary, control. The FSB saw him as a pawn, a tool to be shaped and directed according to their needs. They didn't need his consent. They only needed his compliance. And to ensure that compliance, they employed psychological tactics that were both subtle and ruthless. Whenever he showed signs of resistance, they would pull back slightly, allowing him a brief sense of freedom, a momentary reprieve. But they always returned, drawing him in further, reminding him that his life in Russia was no longer his own. The FSB didn't need to threaten him outright. Their power was far more insidious, built on an understanding of human nature, of fear, and of loyalty. Pavel found himself trapped in a reality he could hardly recognize. The Russia he had returned to was nothing like the one he had imagined in his hopeful days in Canada. His dreams of contributing to society, of building a better Russia, had been twisted, repurposed by forces that valued control over growth, loyalty over progress. The FSB had ensnared him in a system where he was no longer an individual, but a means to an end, a carefully molded asset, molded not by force, but by the invisible hand of manipulation. The FSB had made their move, but they hadn't yet revealed the full extent of their plan. To them, Pavel was only beginning his journey. They saw in him a long-term asset, someone who could be conditioned, guided, and ultimately transformed into an instrument of their influence in the West. Pavel's knowledge and connections were valuable, yes, but the FSB had grander visions, ones that stretched beyond a single man's life, across borders, and into the very heart of global power. Pavel had sensed the shift gradually, like a faint, unsettling sound that only grows louder over time. What had started as a series of helpful gestures and friendly connections had evolved into something much darker, something that felt like a quiet but unbreakable chain around him. The realization dawned slowly, almost painfully. He wasn't just back in Russia to build his career. He had become a target. His life was no longer his own. It began with the feeling of being watched. At first, he brushed it off, telling himself it was just nerves or paranoia, the natural tension of readjusting to a society that seemed more closed off than the one he'd known in Canada. But as days turned into weeks, the subtle presence of eyes on him became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the glances from strangers on the street or the familiar faces that kept appearing in unexpected places. It was the sensation of being observed, studied, every move silently catalogued. Pavel tried to push these thoughts aside, focusing instead on his work and his aspirations. But everywhere he turned, he was reminded that his path had already been chosen for him. Every job offer, every coincidental meeting, every opportunity that seemed to fall into his lap was tainted by a lingering suspicion. He wasn't the one in control. The FSB had embedded itself into the fabric of his daily life, invisible but omnipresent, a shadow he could never escape. One night, as he walked home, he noticed a man leaning casually against a lamppost. Their eyes met briefly, and the man nodded, almost as if in acknowledgement. Pavel quickened his pace, feeling a chill run through him. The encounter seemed innocent, nothing more than a passing stranger. But when he saw the same man again the following day, and the day after that, he felt the weight of an unspoken message. He was being followed, monitored in the most direct way possible. And the message was clear. There was no privacy, no corner of his life that the FSB couldn't reach. Pavel began testing his theory, taking longer routes home, ducking into cafes, watching to see if he was truly being trailed. Every time, he would catch a glimpse of the same faces, silent, watchful, always maintaining a distance but never losing sight of him. They weren't trying to be invisible. On the contrary, they wanted him to know he was being watched. It was a calculated move, a tactic designed to instill a deep, gnawing paranoia that would wear down his resolve and remind him of his place in their scheme. And then came the first veiled threat, delivered in a way that was almost casual, almost too ordinary. He was having tea with a family friend, someone who had been especially close to him in recent months. They spoke about everyday matters, discussing news, exchanging pleasantries. But as the conversation drifted, the friend leaned in, lowering his voice ever so slightly. "It's good that your family is nearby," he said, his tone warm but firm. "It keeps you grounded, makes you think twice about big changes." The words lingered in the air, deceptively harmless but loaded with a clear implication. Pavel's family, his aging parents, his younger brother, were nearby, easily reachable. If Pavel thought about stepping out of line, about distancing himself from the FSB's plans, it wouldn't be him alone who would suffer the consequences. He nodded politely, pretending to understand it as a piece of friendly advice. But inside, his mind raced. He had heard the warning loud and clear. Pavel tried to confide in a friend from his university days, someone he believed he could trust. He mentioned his concerns, hinting at the control the FSB seemed to have over his life, the feeling that he was trapped in a world of invisible strings and silent threats. But as he spoke, he noticed the friend's gaze shift, a flicker of discomfort passing over his face. There was no reassurance, no promise of help, just a careful, measured silence, followed by a quick change of subject. That was when Pavel realized just how deeply isolated he had become. The FSB's influence wasn't limited to him alone. It extended to everyone around him. Friends, family, colleagues, they were all connected by an invisible web, each person either complicit in the agency's agenda or too fearful to acknowledge it. The walls were closing in, and he was truly, unmistakably alone. Desperation crept in, mingling with fear. Pavel thought about leaving, about finding a way out of Russia and away from the FSB's reach. But the more he considered it, the more impossible it seemed. The agency had built an unbreakable chain around him, each link forged from subtle manipulation and psychological pressure. If he tried to leave, his family would be at risk. If he resisted, his career and future would vanish in an instant. And the FSB knew this. They knew that his love for his family, his ambition, his desire for stability, all bound him tighter than any physical restraint ever could. The surveillance intensified. A phone call from his mother would be interrupted by faint clicks on the line, a reminder that his conversations were not private. Emails went missing, appointments were rescheduled without explanation, and the sense of intrusion grew, creeping into every aspect of his life. The FSB's reach seemed limitless, extending not just into his public life, but into the most intimate corners of his existence. Every day became a balancing act, a constant performance of compliance, as he attempted to navigate his life within the boundaries they had drawn for him. He knew the consequences of stepping outside those boundaries were severe, even if they were never explicitly stated. The FSB didn't need to threaten him openly. Their power was understood, and their control was enforced through fear, silence, and the careful dismantling of his independence. In moments of solitude, Pavel's mind returned to the dreams he'd once held, the hope he'd brought back with him to Russia, the vision of making a meaningful impact. But that vision was gone, replaced by a grim reality that offered no escape. The FSB had built a cage around him, a cage made not of walls but of psychological chains, each link forged from loyalty, fear, and the unspoken promise of consequences. For Pavel, the path was clear. There would be no leaving, no breaking free, no return to the life he had once imagined. The FSB had bound him in ways that were as invisible as they were unbreakable, leaving him with no choice but to submit, to accept the life they had chosen for him. And so, Pavel continued on, outwardly the same as before, but internally changed, his spirit weighed down by a force he couldn't defy. He was now part of the FSB's world, a pawn in their game of influence, bound to their will by an invisible contract that held his family, his future, and his very sense of self in its grip. The trap had closed, and Pavel was caught, left to face a life where his only choice was to obey. For most people, the Federal Security Service, or FSB, conjures images of intelligence operatives and spies, the cold shadows of the Russian state at work. But what many don't realize is that this powerful organization has extended its reach into one of the most lucrative and destructive criminal enterprises in the world: drug trafficking. Pavel, caught in the web of the FSB's influence, had an inside look at just how far they were willing to go to fund their secretive operations. Through him, we gain a rare glimpse into this hidden empire. The FSB's drug network spans the entirety of Europe, and it all begins in the ports of southern Spain. Here, the FSB collaborates with organized crime syndicates that control access to the coastline, a region notorious for its role in international smuggling. Shipments of narcotics from South America arrive hidden within containers, disguised as shipments of common goods like coffee beans or industrial materials. Once docked, these containers pass through customs, seemingly unnoticed, with key officials conveniently looking the other way. Pavel learned that these officials weren't simply negligent. They had been handpicked and bought by the FSB to ensure that shipments moved without delay or detection. Once the drugs land in Spain, the operation truly begins. From here, the shipments make their way inland, hidden in plain sight among legal cargo that moves through the continent's transportation arteries. Pavel observed how carefully the FSB planned each phase, calculating every leg of the journey to minimize risk. The routes cut through France, where the FSB's network of influence is particularly strong. In cities like Marseille and Lyon, drug lords and corrupt customs agents work hand in hand with FSB operatives, making it one of the most secure points of transit in the operation. The FSB's control over these routes is not left to chance. In France, specific officials are placed strategically along the drug corridor, at borders, in customs, and even within local law enforcement. Bribes come in the form of money deposited into offshore accounts, promotions granted quietly in exchange for loyalty, and, for those who hesitated, subtle threats to ensure their cooperation. Through these layers of influence, the FSB creates a safe passage corridor that stretches across the heart of Western Europe. From France, the shipments head north, crossing into Germany, where the FSB's logistical mastery is on full display. Major transportation hubs, such as Hamburg and Frankfurt, serve as transfer points where drugs are moved from one carrier to another, carefully repacked and disguised to avoid suspicion. The FSB's operatives handle these transfers with precision, timing everything down to the minute. Each carrier knows only their part in the operation, minimizing the risk of leaks. Pavel saw how these operatives were trained to function with military precision, managing their duties without questioning the purpose or destination of the cargo they carried. As the drugs make their way across Germany, they move through a series of predetermined drop zones, warehouses and logistics centers owned by shell companies that exist solely to support the FSB's trafficking operation. These facilities are equipped with secure rooms and hidden compartments where drugs can be stored temporarily before moving to the next phase. And once again, German officials, strategically bribed or intimidated, allow these operations to proceed unimpeded. Pavel witnessed the precision and ruthlessness with which the FSB managed these logistics, each piece moving in a carefully orchestrated dance of corruption and secrecy. The journey continues, moving further east across Europe. The drugs enter the Baltic states, where local crime syndicates with long-standing ties to Moscow act as intermediaries. These syndicates are powerful entities in their own right, deeply entrenched in smuggling and black market operations. The FSB relies on these local partners to handle customs and border security in the Baltic region. In exchange, they provide the syndicates with favors, access to black market weaponry, and, perhaps most valuable of all, the FSB's protection. In the Baltic states, the FSB's influence is nearly absolute. Customs officials at smaller ports and border checkpoints are often loyal to Moscow, allowing FSB shipments to pass through with ease. In these countries, the FSB's operatives hold sway over local governments and law enforcement, ensuring that any questions about suspicious cargo are quickly dismissed. Even routine inspections are bypassed as officials, well aware of who pulls the strings, follow orders without question. Pavel learned that in these regions, the FSB was not merely operating within the system, they were the system. The FSB's trafficking operation reaches its final destination in Russia, but the journey from Spain to Moscow has already turned a staggering profit. By the time the drugs arrive in Russian cities, they are repackaged and distributed further, finding their way into every corner of society. The revenue generated is funneled back into the FSB's secret accounts, funding espionage, influence operations, and, ironically, even domestic security measures designed to combat organized crime, the very crime the FSB profits from and perpetuates. Pavel came to understand that this wasn't just a simple trafficking route. It was an empire within an empire, a self-sustaining network that combined logistics, corruption, and fear to generate profits and control far beyond Russian borders. He realized that this trafficking network served dual purposes. It was both a source of massive funding and a weapon of influence. Through drugs, the FSB could destabilize societies, control populations, and manipulate criminal organizations that would otherwise have no loyalty to Russia. One story Pavel heard highlighted the full scope of the FSB's influence. In southern France, a low-level customs officer who had tried to report suspicious shipments was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Official reports dismissed it as an accident, but those familiar with the operation knew better. It was a warning, a message to others that interference would not be tolerated. The officer's silence secured, the operation continued as if nothing had happened, the FSB's control growing with every unchecked shipment. Pavel also learned of another chilling example: an Eastern European truck driver caught with a suspicious cargo of narcotics. In most cases, such an arrest would lead to exposure and potential disruption of the trafficking route. But the FSB intervened, manipulating the evidence and bribing local authorities to clear the driver of all charges. He returned to work without consequence, a pawn in a game he would never fully understand, helping to perpetuate a cycle of crime and control that stretched far beyond his view. As Pavel pieced together these stories, he felt a deep sense of horror at the enormity of the operation. What had once seemed like isolated incidents, the occasional favor to a customs official or the mysterious death of a whistleblower, now revealed itself as a meticulously organized empire of crime, a shadow operation engineered to support Russia's most covert agendas. This wasn't about making money. It was about securing power, extending Moscow's influence across borders and into the very fabric of European society. In Pavel's eyes, the FSB was no longer just an intelligence agency. It had transformed into a criminal empire, a machine of influence that used corruption, violence, and control as tools to further its agenda. Through his forced involvement, Pavel understood that the FSB's operations were as much about political dominance as they were about profit. Every border crossed, every bribe paid, every official intimidated, all of it served Moscow's goals of spreading its reach across the West. And yet, this was only the beginning. The FSB's drug trafficking network was just one part of a much larger design, a strategy that Pavel would come to realize had implications that went far beyond Europe's borders. For the FSB, drug trafficking was a means to an end, a stepping stone in their broader mission to manipulate and control on an international scale. If there was a singular tool that exemplified the FSB's precision, reach, and unrelenting control, it was their infamous document factory. Pavel would come to know this as one of the FSB's most valuable assets, a sprawling operation, deeply hidden, that could produce forged documents with a level of accuracy that rivaled government-issued identification. This wasn't just a forgery operation. It was a full-scale production unit capable of crafting passports, IDs, visas, and security credentials that looked, felt, and even scanned as legitimate. The factory operated out of an undisclosed facility somewhere on the outskirts of Moscow, in a building that appeared ordinary enough from the outside. But inside, it was a highly secure, sterile environment filled with state-of-the-art equipment, specialized printing machines capable of microprinting, advanced laminators, embossing devices, and even RFID programming tools to encode security chips. Pavel learned that this facility was staffed by experts in document design, security features, and forgery detection, all working together to produce documents indistinguishable from the originals. The factory's goal wasn't simply to replicate documents. It was to create perfect clones, documents so flawless that even the most rigorous international security checks would fail to detect them. Each document forged here was a masterpiece in its own right. The FSB's forgers weren't amateurs or criminals working in back rooms. They were professionals trained to mimic every detail, from holographic images to embedded security features. Passports bore accurate watermarks, driver's licenses included the correct reflective elements, and even the thickness and feel of each card or booklet matched the originals. The FSB had perfected the art of forgery to such a degree that operatives could pass through checkpoints and borders undetected, blending seamlessly into any society they were assigned to infiltrate. Pavel soon realized the true scale of the FSB's ambitions when he learned how these documents were used. It wasn't just about slipping agents across borders, it was about creating identities, entire lives built from scratch. A single operative might carry multiple identities, a French passport for Europe, a Canadian driver's license for North America, and a corporate ID for a high-security job at a multinational company. Each identity was fully backed by the FSB's resources, complete with supporting documents like birth certificates, tax records, and even digital trails meticulously planted across various databases. One particularly striking example involved an FSB operative who had been placed in the Netherlands under a false name. He held a position as an IT consultant for a reputable cybersecurity firm. His credentials appeared entirely legitimate, supported by a seemingly flawless European Union passport, references, and a fully verifiable work history. His role gave him access to sensitive data across various corporations in Europe, allowing him to relay critical intelligence back to Moscow. The FSB had created this identity not overnight, but over several years, slowly building a life history that could withstand even the closest scrutiny. By the time the operative took up his position, he was not just a spy. He was a fully integrated part of the European professional landscape. The FSB's influence through these forged identities was pervasive, reaching into areas beyond intelligence and into the heart of commerce and government. In Germany, a high-ranking official in customs enforcement had unknowingly hired an FSB agent who had entered the country under the guise of a well-credentialed European diplomat. With his diplomatic immunity and a full suite of falsified documents, he gained unrestricted access to Germany's customs network, gathering data on key transportation hubs, border security protocols, and the locations of sensitive facilities. Over the course of 2 years, he funneled valuable information back to the FSB, providing Moscow with insights that would otherwise be unattainable. Pavel discovered that the document factory wasn't just producing passports or licenses, it was manufacturing entire operations. Each document was a piece of a larger puzzle, part of a vast, meticulously orchestrated strategy. The FSB didn't simply send agents out into the world, they embedded them, rooted them into foreign systems, so deeply that their removal would be as complex and destabilizing as removing a vital organ from a living body. The document factory was an essential component of this strategy, a tool that allowed the FSB to manipulate people, corporations, and even governments from the inside. But it wasn't just Europe that was affected. Pavel learned that the FSB had successfully planted operatives in Canada and the United States, using similarly forged identities to secure positions in fields as diverse as finance, technology, and even law enforcement. In one case, an FSB agent used a forged Canadian passport to secure a role as an executive at a financial institution in Toronto. This position granted him access to high-level transactions, financial records, and client data for influential companies across North America. His role provided the FSB with a financial intelligence foothold in the West, giving Moscow insights into economic activities, market trends, and potential vulnerabilities within Western financial systems. The sheer breadth of these forgeries was staggering. Every document produced was unique, crafted with specific missions in mind, each one a tool designed to unlock a door, access sensitive information, or secure leverage. And for each identity created, there was a rigorous vetting process. Operatives would be trained to adopt their new personas meticulously, learning everything about their supposed backgrounds, down to favorite foods, childhood experiences, and personal quirks that could withstand even the most invasive questioning. Pavel also came to understand how the FSB's document forgery operations intersected with its trafficking networks. Forged passports and IDs enabled drug couriers to move seamlessly across borders, disguised as business travelers, tourists, or diplomats. The FSB's trafficking routes were lined with operatives who held multiple identities, allowing them to enter and exit countries without raising suspicion. Even when local authorities became aware of suspicious activity, the operatives' identities were so well constructed that investigations often hit dead ends, leaving officials frustrated and unable to prosecute. One chilling example involved a forged UN diplomatic passport. An FSB operative posing as a UN official gained entry into restricted areas at an international summit, allowing him to gather intelligence on Western leaders, their security protocols, and even the layout of critical venues. The operatives were coached to act with the confidence and familiarity of experienced diplomats, and their documents were nearly impossible to dispute, even under intense scrutiny. Pavel could only marvel at the precision and planning behind each forgery. The FSB's document factory wasn't just a forgery operation. It was a lifeline, an essential artery in Moscow's network of global influence. Every piece of false identification created there served as an extension of Russian power, allowing Moscow's reach to extend invisibly into foreign lands, companies, and government agencies. Through his time entangled with the FSB, Pavel understood that the document factory wasn't simply about creating identities. It was about erasing boundaries, blurring lines between legal and illegal, real and fabricated. The FSB's approach to forgery was systematic, almost mechanical, yet it was guided by a vision of power that was anything but. Each document served as a silent declaration of control, a reminder that Moscow's agents could be anywhere, hidden in plain sight, armed with identities that gave them unparalleled access to the world's most guarded spaces. By the end of his observations, Pavel realized that the FSB's forgeries weren't just a tool. They were a weapon, a means of infiltrating society without detection, a way to embed Moscow's influence in every corner of the globe. And as he pieced together the scope of their operations, he knew that the FSB's document factory was more than just a facility. It was a cornerstone of a hidden empire, one that relied on forgery not merely to pass through borders, but to dissolve them. As Pavel became further enmeshed in the FSB's operations, he began to see that the agency's power extended far beyond borders and bureaucracies. The FSB wasn't simply an intelligence agency. It was a sprawling network of influence rooted in corruption, bribery, and ruthless intimidation. The agency's reach spread across Europe, infiltrating every level of society, from government offices to organized crime circles. Pavel came to understand that the FSB had built a system of alliances and pressure points that secured Moscow's interests, regardless of international laws or boundaries. One of the FSB's key alliances lay in its partnership with European organized crime families. These alliances weren't born out of loyalty, but were forged through mutual benefit and, when necessary, brute force. In southern Europe, particularly in Italy, the FSB cultivated relationships with mafia families who controlled smuggling routes and underground markets. It was an alliance based on profit and shared interests. The FSB offered these crime syndicates protection, intelligence on law enforcement operations, and access to Russian weapons, all in exchange for loyalty and cooperation. Pavel learned of a high-level meeting that took place in the secluded mountains of Sicily, where FSB officials met with the heads of several mafia families. Held in a remote, heavily guarded villa, this gathering wasn't just a casual discussion. It was a negotiation between powers, a calculated alignment of criminal forces. The FSB representatives laid out their proposal. In return for cooperation in drug and weapons trafficking, the mafia families would receive FSB protection and privileged access to Russian contraband. The FSB needed the mafia's control over smuggling routes, and in return, the mafia received guarantees that Russian intelligence would provide cover, feeding them intelligence on law enforcement's movements, upcoming investigations, and rival criminal groups. This partnership proved lucrative for both sides. As a result, the mafia could operate with impunity, emboldened by the knowledge that Moscow's eye was on their side, while the FSB gained near unrestricted access to ports, supply routes, and distribution networks that spanned the continent. And it wasn't just about drugs and weapons. This network of cooperation extended to human trafficking and even money laundering schemes that generated millions for both Moscow and its criminal allies. The FSB's influence didn't stop with organized crime. They worked systematically to embed themselves within the structures of European government and law enforcement, creating a network of officials who could be manipulated or coerced into service. Bribery was common, facilitated through offshore accounts and Swiss bank transfers. But when money wasn't enough, the FSB resorted to intimidation. Pavel knew of one German customs official who had initially resisted the FSB's advances. He was a dedicated public servant who took pride in his integrity, refusing offers that came his way. But when threats turned to his family, the official relented. Under intense pressure, he became yet another cog in the FSB's machinery, allowing shipments to pass through checkpoints without question, ensuring that cargo went unsearched. In France, Pavel learned of another disturbing case. A mid-ranking government official had stumbled upon FSB activities related to drug trafficking in Marseille. Initially, he sought to report it, but the FSB intercepted his intentions before he could take action. They confronted him with fabricated evidence of corruption, implicating him in crimes he'd never committed. With his reputation and career on the line, the official faced a choice: cooperate with Moscow or see his life destroyed by a scandal he couldn't disprove. In the end, he capitulated, becoming yet another pawn in the FSB's complex game of influence and control. The FSB's reach was pervasive, stretching across borders and across institutions. In Eastern Europe, their operations relied heavily on criminal syndicates familiar with Russia's methods, people who already had ties to Moscow and were willing to cooperate in exchange for power. In places like Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, the FSB had local officials on their payroll, many of whom were pressured into compliance through old KGB-era tactics, targeting personal vulnerabilities, leveraging family connections, and instilling fear of retribution. Pavel heard stories of these alliances working almost too perfectly. For instance, in Latvia, an FSB operative managed to blackmail a local politician by uncovering compromising information about his private life. This politician had significant influence over local law enforcement budgets, and once compromised, he used his position to quietly divert resources away from investigating Russian operatives and instead toward more benign targets. The FSB, through this one compromised official, was able to operate without fear of interference, and as a result, entire neighborhoods became hubs for smuggling operations and safe houses for FSB assets. But one of the FSB's most chilling methods of influence was its use of family as leverage. Pavel came to understand that for many officials, compliance wasn't about money or career advancement. It was about protecting those they loved. One Italian police officer, for example, had been openly resistant to cooperating with Moscow's agents until he was approached with photos of his children playing outside their school. The message was clear: cooperate, or risk harm coming to those closest to him. After that, he became one of the FSB's most reliable assets, turning a blind eye to shipments moving through his jurisdiction, and even providing information on local investigations into Russian activities. The FSB's network of influence was a tightly woven tapestry, with each thread carefully placed to secure Moscow's interests. This web extended beyond individual officials or criminal organizations. It seeped into the very institutions designed to protect society. In some cases, entire departments had been compromised, each officer or official acting not on behalf of their government but under the shadowy influence of Russian intelligence. In one particularly sinister instance, the FSB managed to place one of their operatives inside the office of a high-ranking European Union official. The operative posed as an administrative aide handling logistics and appointments. From this seemingly innocuous position, he gathered intelligence on the EU's internal deliberations on border security, migration policies, and counterintelligence initiatives. With this information, Moscow was able to anticipate and counteract EU policies that would interfere with its own agenda. The FSB used the intelligence to redirect shipments, modify smuggling routes, and adjust their tactics, ensuring that European security measures rarely affected their activities. As Pavel connected the dots, he saw the horrifying scale of the FSB's influence. It wasn't just a matter of corruption. It was a strategic takeover, a methodical ensnaring of European infrastructure and governance in a web of loyalty and fear. From police precincts in Berlin to customs offices in Paris, from ports in Italy to municipal governments in the Baltics, the FSB had placed people in positions of power who were either complicit or coerced, each one ensuring that Moscow's objectives would be achieved without resistance. The FSB didn't view this influence as a luxury. To them, it was a necessity. Every compromised official, every crime syndicate alliance, every blackmailed individual served a purpose in maintaining Moscow's control over a continent. This wasn't just about profit or influence. It was about power. The ability to operate invisibly across borders, to turn European institutions into unwitting collaborators in Russia's grander design. Pavel realized that the FSB's control over Europe was nearly absolute, through bribery, intimidation, and a ruthless willingness to target anyone who got in their way. They had established a foothold that extended into nearly every major European institution. And with each alliance, each act of coercion, they solidified a network that went deeper, stretching across Europe like an invisible net. It was a net that Pavel was now painfully aware of, one that had ensnared countless individuals. Politicians, police officers, customs agents, all bound to Moscow through a blend of fear, loyalty, and corruption. For Pavel, understanding the extent of this network brought a chilling clarity. The FSB had created an empire within Europe, a hidden infrastructure of power and control. And as he learned more, he realized that this wasn't a series of isolated incidents. This was a deliberate strategy, a silent conquest that transformed every border, every institution, every individual into a potential tool for Moscow's agenda. With their operations well established across Europe, the FSB began to turn its focus westward, looking toward North America. Canada and the United States represented new frontiers for influence, with economic and strategic opportunities that Moscow could not afford to ignore. The FSB's strategy was meticulous and covert. Rather than storming across borders, they would seep in like shadows, placing operatives into key cities, blending them seamlessly into North American society. And, as Pavel would learn, they did so with chilling precision. The FSB's document factory played a central role in this operation. Using forged passports, visas, and professional credentials, the FSB could create identities that were flawless, supported by a web of fictitious histories and carefully constructed digital trails. These agents arrived in Canada and the US under various guises: a mid-level tech consultant, a businessman from Europe, a language teacher, or even an IT contractor. Each identity was tailored to blend in, raising no suspicions. These were not spies in the traditional sense. They were ordinary people on paper, equipped to disappear into the fabric of society. One notable case involved an FSB operative who entered Canada under the alias of Alexander Karpov, a business consultant specializing in emerging markets. Alexander's credentials were impeccable. He carried a Russian passport stamped with legitimate visas, a Canadian work permit, and recommendations from supposed clients in Europe and Asia. The FSB had even fabricated an employment history that included references from multinational companies backed by LinkedIn profiles and social media accounts detailing his career. To anyone who met him, Alexander seemed like a well-educated, ambitious consultant looking to expand his business in North America. Alexander set up shop in Toronto, a bustling financial hub where business consultants and some foreign investors are common. He rented an office, attended networking events, and joined business associations, slowly building a network of contacts in finance and technology. Through these connections, he gained access to private meetings, learned of upcoming mergers and acquisitions, and collected intelligence on Canadian industries. Alexander's role was clear: gather financial intelligence, map out influential figures in the corporate world, and look for vulnerabilities that the FSB could later exploit. All of it was done quietly, invisibly, as part of his consulting work, while he remained just another face in Toronto's crowded streets. But not all FSB operatives in North America operated under high-profile roles. Some took on more humble identities, carefully designed to blend into communities where they could gather information without drawing attention. In New York City, an FSB agent known by his alias, Dmitry, arrived as a construction foreman, a job that allowed him to move freely within the city's vast workforce. His documents portrayed him as an immigrant worker with years of experience, a background that raised no suspicion in a city known for its diversity. Dmitry's job granted him access to sites across New York, including government offices and financial centers undergoing renovation. Using his position, he would occasionally plant small listening devices, transmitting conversations back to FSB operatives in Russia. These devices were discreet, hidden within walls or ceilings, nearly impossible to detect. Dmitry would leave the job site, leaving behind a quiet but constant stream of intelligence flowing back to Moscow. It was a small but effective operation, one of many micro-operations that the FSB employed to gather insights on American institutions without the need for grandiose espionage. The FSB's strategy in North America extended beyond surveillance. It involved gaining footholds in influential industries. In San Francisco, a man known by the alias Viktor Morozov joined a prominent tech company as a project manager. His background was in software engineering, supported by a degree from a European university that existed only in Moscow's records. With this identity, Viktor settled into the Silicon Valley scene, networking with tech entrepreneurs, attending conferences, and blending into the fast-paced world of innovation and investment. Viktor's role was more than just collecting intelligence. His objective was to build rapport with innovators, venture capitalists, and influential figures within the tech industry. By doing so, he could identify companies working on cutting-edge technology, specifically those developing artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and data encryption. His assignment was clear: gather knowledge, assess emerging technologies, and identify any potential openings where the FSB could exploit or co-opt valuable developments. Moscow wanted to stay ahead in the tech race, and Viktor was their eyes and ears within Silicon Valley's labyrinthine networks. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., an FSB agent known as Natalia took on a role that required a different level of finesse. Posing as an administrative assistant in a lobbying firm, Natalia wasn't there to gather classified government information directly. Her job was to monitor political trends, track influential politicians, and assess the key issues shaping American foreign policy. As an assistant, she had access to scheduling details, notes from private meetings, and insights into the firm's client roster. She listened carefully to conversations, observed the dynamics between lobbyists and policymakers, and reported her findings back to Moscow. Natalia was no spy in the traditional sense, but her position allowed her to gather intelligence that shaped the FSB's understanding of US political currents. These operatives lived seemingly ordinary lives, adopting hobbies, making friends, and establishing routines. They became part of the communities around them, their true identities hidden behind layers of fabricated history. For Pavel, this level of integration was both impressive and unsettling. The FSB's approach wasn't to stand out, it was to blend in, to make their presence so unremarkable that it would go unnoticed. Their agents weren't foreign figures lurking in the shadows. They were neighbors, colleagues, people attending the same cafes and gyms. They could be anyone. The FSB's operations in North America were not limited to major cities. They strategically placed operatives in smaller communities, where law enforcement and immigration checks were less stringent, and where long-term surveillance could be conducted without much attention. For instance, in a small town near the US-Canada border, an FSB operative working as a truck driver routinely crossed back and forth, transporting goods but also collecting data on border security, routes, checkpoint vulnerabilities. His seemingly routine trips allowed him to report on the frequency of inspections, the technology used, and any weak points in security. A valuable asset for Moscow's intelligence. This network of operatives represented an invisible bridge, connecting North America to Moscow in ways that few could imagine. Each agent, each identity, each seemingly mundane life served a purpose within the FSB's strategy. While their roles varied, from consultants and tech workers to construction foremen and lobbyists, each was part of a larger tapestry, woven with the intention of expanding Moscow's influence, gathering intelligence, and, when necessary, creating leverage. The deeper Pavel delved into the FSB's operations, the more surreal it became. The agency wasn't merely placing spies, it was planting seeds, allowing them to grow naturally, to weave themselves into the very fabric of North American society. These agents lived lives that were indistinguishable from those around them. They paid taxes, attended local events, and even participated in community groups. By all accounts, they were normal residents until Moscow needed them to act. Pavel understood the genius of this approach. The FSB wasn't seeking immediate results. They were patient, willing to wait years, even decades, for the right moment. Their influence extended beyond politics and security. It seeped into culture, business, and everyday interactions. They could pull strings when needed, shift perspectives subtly, and, most importantly, gather insights that would be otherwise inaccessible. This wasn't espionage in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, a silent integration that ensured Moscow's presence in North America without ever needing to announce itself. As Pavel pieced together these operations, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The FSB's reach was far greater than he had ever imagined, its agents embedded in places that seemed too ordinary to be dangerous. The scale of Moscow's influence began to hit home for him. This wasn't a simple game of spy versus spy, it was an infiltration of society itself. A strategy that placed agents into the heart of North American life, leaving them ready to act when the time came. And for those around them, there would be no warning, no way to see it coming. Pavel had heard whispers of the FSB's connections to organized crime back in Europe, but it wasn't until he uncovered their alliances within North America that he truly grasped the extent of Moscow's reach. The FSB wasn't merely infiltrating government offices and financial sectors. They were embedding themselves within the very veins of the criminal underworld in the United States and Canada. By aligning themselves with powerful criminal syndicates, the FSB could bypass barriers, move narcotics, and launder money with a level of efficiency and stealth that kept their operations virtually undetectable. The FSB's strategy was methodical. Rather than creating a new criminal network from scratch, they tapped into existing syndicates, powerful organizations with extensive influence over drug trafficking, smuggling routes, and black market networks. These syndicates were already well established in major cities across North America, with roots extending back decades. The FSB recognized that by working with these groups, they could secure access to local distribution channels, evade law enforcement, and make use of the syndicate's infrastructure to further their own agenda. In the Canadian underworld, the FSB focused their attention on a network known for its control over drug routes across the US-Canada border. This organization was deeply entrenched in cities like Toronto and Vancouver, its influence stretching across both sides of the border. The FSB operatives began by making connections with the lower ranks of the syndicate, meeting in private clubs and unassuming bars. They presented themselves as business partners with access to high-quality narcotics from Europe, products that were always in high demand. But what they offered went beyond mere supply. They promised security, intelligence on law enforcement operations, and even connections in Europe to help expand the syndicate's reach internationally. One of the key cases involved an FSB operative known only by his alias, Sergei. Using a forged Canadian passport, Sergei was introduced to the leaders of a drug syndicate in Vancouver, presenting himself as a businessman with high-level contacts in Moscow. Sergei offered them a lucrative deal. In exchange for a share of their profits, he could facilitate a steady flow of narcotics from Europe, bypassing the usual hurdles and risks. What the syndicate didn't realize was that Sergei's true purpose went beyond drug trafficking. He was there to establish a covert network for Moscow, to identify influential players, and to gain intelligence on North American law enforcement tactics. Sergei's integration into the syndicate was seamless. Over time, he gained their trust, sharing intelligence on upcoming raids, shifts in border security, and new police technologies, all information sourced from the FSB's surveillance operations. In return, the syndicate provided Sergei with the logistical support needed to transport drugs across North America, utilizing established distribution channels and safe houses across Canada and the northern United States. Through these connections, the FSB effectively created a network of narcotics pipelines that flowed from Moscow's criminal allies in Europe to cities across North America, all under the radar of law enforcement. The FSB's infiltration into US criminal networks was equally insidious. In major cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, FSB operatives embedded themselves with notorious gangs and drug cartels, building relationships through carefully orchestrated meetings and shared business interests. In New York, an FSB agent known as Igor posed as an Eastern European arms dealer, offering weaponry sourced from Russian stockpiles to a local gang. The weapons themselves were only part of the deal. Igor's true goal was to form alliances that would allow Moscow to establish a foothold in America's criminal underworld. Igor's meetings took place in the shadowy corners of nightclubs, underground bars, and abandoned warehouses. With each encounter, he gained more information on the gang's operations, mapping their routes, learning their schedules, and identifying their weak points. In exchange for his services, he provided intelligence that the gang could use to outmaneuver rivals and avoid law enforcement. It was a mutually beneficial relationship, but one that left the gang unknowingly entangled in Moscow's broader schemes. They became a conduit for FSB operations, moving narcotics, laundering money, and providing safe passage for Russian agents entering the US under the guise of criminal collaborators. In one particularly intricate operation, the FSB used a criminal network in Chicago to launder money generated from drug sales across Europe. The Chicago network was known for its ties to international banking and real estate, industries that provided ample opportunities for financial manipulation. The FSB operatives worked closely with key figures in the syndicate, funneling dirty money through a series of shell companies, offshore accounts, and high-stakes real estate transactions. This method was highly effective. By the time the money reached its final destination, it was clean, untraceable, and ready to be reinvested into Moscow's intelligence operations. Pavel became aware of another alarming operation in Los Angeles, where FSB operatives had collaborated with a local cartel to distribute narcotics through the city's extensive port system. Los Angeles, with its access to international shipping lanes, was a prime target for smuggling operations. The FSB operatives used their connections within the cartel to ensure that shipments could enter and leave the ports with minimal inspection. They supplied the cartel with advanced technology, including encrypted communication devices and intelligence on customs patrol patterns, effectively guaranteeing the success of each operation. What began as a partnership of convenience soon became a dependency. The FSB's intelligence and technological support enabled the cartel to expand its influence across the western United States, and in turn, the cartel granted Moscow a covert distribution network. This relationship allowed Russian narcotics to be funneled into North American cities, with the proceeds fueling Moscow's broader goals. For the cartel, the alliance was a windfall. For the FSB, it was another foothold, another way to exert control and undermine the stability of American society from within. The FSB's alliances weren't limited to the United States' largest cities. In border towns and smaller communities, they formed relationships with gangs and smugglers who controlled rural trafficking routes. In the American Southwest, FSB operatives coordinated with a network of smugglers operating along remote stretches of desert, exploiting weaknesses in border security. These operatives used their intelligence on American patrol schedules and technology to provide safe passage for drugs, weapons, and even agents disguised as laborers or travelers. Pavel realized that these alliances were about more than just profit. They were about influence. By embedding themselves within criminal networks, the FSB gained the ability to shape, manipulate, and, if necessary, destabilize North American communities from within. They weren't simply partnering with criminals. They were absorbing them into Moscow's sphere of influence, turning them into unwitting allies in an international strategy of subversion. In one chilling account, Pavel learned of an FSB plan to use its alliance with a New York gang to target a rival politician who had been outspoken against Russian influence. The gang was given resources, including information about the politician's schedule and routines, enabling them to launch an intimidation campaign. While the gang believed they were asserting local dominance, they were, in reality, serving as a proxy for Moscow, pressuring an American political figure under the guise of gang violence. The politician, fearful for their safety, eventually softened their stance, an outcome the FSB had engineered from thousands of miles away. The more Pavel uncovered, the more he understood how crime and espionage intertwined in the FSB's strategy. This wasn't just about moving drugs or making money. It was about cultivating influence, creating chaos, and blurring the lines between criminal activity and covert operations. The FSB's alliances with North American criminal networks allowed them to operate with a freedom that traditional espionage could never provide. In these alliances, Moscow had found a perfect weapon, a way to destabilize from within, using the very criminal organizations that American and Canadian authorities struggled to contain. For Pavel, this realization was both horrifying and surreal. The FSB wasn't simply infiltrating North America, they were weaving themselves into the underworld, becoming an unseen force that shaped criminal networks and communities from within. This network of alliances blurred the line between state power and organized crime, creating a layered, deeply embedded system of influence that was as resilient as it was invisible. Moscow's influence, he understood, was no longer just on the other side of the ocean. It was here, hidden in plain sight, spreading through the very institutions and criminal networks that North America fought to control. As Pavel unraveled the FSB's operations in North America, he was shocked by the agency's audacity. It wasn't enough for Moscow to embed operatives into criminal networks and local communities. They had gone a step further, directly infiltrating North American institutions through their influence over government officials and law enforcement. These weren't traditional spies, but local figures with power, access, and authority unwittingly or reluctantly serving Moscow's interests. To the FSB, the officials weren't just potential assets. They were doorways, channels through which information could flow and operations could be shielded. The FSB's methods for identifying potential recruits were sophisticated and targeted. They meticulously analyzed profiles of officials, studying their vulnerabilities, backgrounds, and personal lives to determine their suitability as pawns. The FSB wasn't interested in high-profile targets. They sought individuals who worked quietly behind the scenes, mid-level managers, data analysts, local police captains, or junior government aides. These individuals had valuable access to information, but often operated outside the intense scrutiny reserved for high-ranking officials, making them easier to coerce or manipulate. One of the FSB's first points of entry involved targeting individuals through routine interactions. In several cases, FSB operatives would make contact with local officials at public events, professional gatherings, or even by posing as consultants or business investors. They would engage in casual conversations, gathering small but critical details that could be used to establish rapport and probe for vulnerabilities. For example, they might accidentally learn of financial struggles or relationship issues, casually noting these details for potential exploitation. In one particularly disturbing scenario, an FSB operative operating under the alias Anton infiltrated a state government office in the US as a low-profile consultant. Anton took his time, observing the dynamics within the office, taking note of who seemed disgruntled, overworked, or eager for a way out of financial debt. Over months, he focused on a specific target, a clerk with access to sensitive internal data who was struggling with medical bills for a family member. Anton approached him casually, offering to help out with financial support, no strings attached. The clerk, overwhelmed and grateful, accepted. What began as a kind gesture soon turned into a transactional relationship. The FSB operative began asking for small favors, access to restricted information, updates on internal projects, or even just a look at non-public schedules of certain officials. The clerk, now entangled in Anton's web, found himself sharing details he would have never considered disclosing under normal circumstances. By the time he realized the implications, it was too deep to pull back, knowing that any attempt to sever ties could expose his actions and ruin his life. In Canada, the FSB employed similar tactics, but with a twist. They often targeted officials in rural or remote areas where oversight was minimal and social connections were close-knit. One case involved a Canadian border official in a small town near the US-Canada border. An FSB operative posing as a real estate investor befriended the official, striking up conversations at local events and gradually building trust. Over time, the operative offered a lucrative deal, a significant sum of money in exchange for turning a blind eye to occasional cargo shipments passing through the border without full inspection. This official, tempted by the offer and convinced that he could manage it discreetly, eventually accepted. He began receiving regular payments through an offshore account, unaware that he was now fully compromised. What he saw as harmless looked quite different from Moscow's vantage point. The FSB now had a foothold at a critical border crossing, enabling them to transport goods and personnel without scrutiny. And if the official ever considered backing out, they had a catalogue of evidence against him, proof of every payment received and every shipment allowed through under his watch. For those who refused bribes or resisted initial overtures, the FSB had alternative methods. Pavel learned of a mid-level officer within a US law enforcement agency who had tried to stand his ground when approached by FSB contacts. This officer had stumbled upon suspicious activity tied to an FSB operation and had reported it to his superiors. However, Soon after his report, he received a package at his home containing photos of his family and a typed note. Think carefully about your next steps. His children's school schedules were included in the note, alongside details that no one outside his immediate family could have known. The threat was implicit, but the message was unmistakable. The officer, realizing the danger his family was in, retracted his report, citing a misunderstanding. To the FSB, this wasn't just about silencing one individual. It was a demonstration of their reach, a warning that compliance wasn't optional. After that incident, the officer was subtly encouraged to provide occasional information about his agency's operations, a request he reluctantly obeyed, knowing that the alternative was too risky. Some officials were manipulated without even knowing it. Pavel came across a case involving a high-ranking government contractor in Washington, D.C., who regularly attended conferences and summits related to national security. The FSB operatives cultivated contacts within the contractor's professional circle, gradually building a network around him. They would engage him in innocent conversations, collecting his insights on topics of interest, noting his predictions on upcoming security trends, and subtly steering discussions to extract sensitive information. To the contractor, these interactions were normal professional exchanges, but to the FSB, they were a strategic collection of valuable intelligence. In one particularly troubling instance, a Canadian immigration officer unknowingly became a pawn in Moscow's game. This officer, known for his work in Toronto's immigration services, received an invitation to speak at an international conference on security, expenses paid. The event was organized by a front group affiliated with the FSB. During the conference, he was charmed and flattered by Russian hosts who questioned him on his work, his perspectives on border control, and his experiences dealing with foreign nationals entering Canada. After the conference, the FSB retained contact with him, offering to support his research efforts and provide insights on immigration trends. Over time, the officer began sharing non-public data with these colleagues from Moscow, unaware that he was feeding sensitive information directly into the FSB's hands. These seemingly mundane exchanges allowed the FSB to infiltrate some of North America's most trusted institutions without ever needing a formal recruit. They exploited relationships, played on vulnerabilities, and used psychological manipulation to turn ordinary professionals into unwitting informants. Each interaction was carefully calculated to avoid suspicion, creating an invisible chain of influence that stretched across borders and organizations. What made these tactics so effective was their subtlety. Unlike traditional espionage, the FSB's method didn't require complex recruitment schemes or blackmail dossiers. In most cases, it was enough to make someone feel indebted, scared, or flattered. Officials shared information under the impression that they were aiding international collaboration, or they provided access in exchange for financial stability, never suspecting that they had become part of a global intelligence operation. For Pavel, discovering these layers of infiltration was shocking. He realized that the FSB had turned North America's strengths, its openness, professionalism, and willingness to collaborate, into weaknesses to be exploited. The agency's approach was patient, insidious, and terrifyingly effective. Local officials, unwitting and unprepared, had become cogs in Moscow's machine, feeding information, enabling operations, and unknowingly supporting an agenda that they would have vehemently opposed if they had known the truth. The FSB's influence over local officials wasn't about targeting one person or one office. It was about creating a system, a network of individuals who, through fear, greed, or naivety, were unknowingly loyal to Moscow. And with each compromised official, Moscow's grip on North America tightened, securing not only information but access, control, and the power to shape events from within. While Pavel witnessed the FSB's covert influence in North America, he also began to understand the dynamics that fueled this empire of corruption from within Russia. At the top of the FSB's hierarchy were men who wielded immense power, figures whose influence extended far beyond intelligence and into the realm of untouchable privilege. These were not just officials. They were untouchable elites, high-ranking officers who operated with a level of impunity that defied accountability, protected by Moscow's unbreakable shield. Among them was Colonel Anatoly Petrov, a name that echoed within the agency and on the streets, synonymous with both wealth and ruthlessness. Colonel Petrov was known to be one of the masterminds behind several high-profile smuggling networks that stretched across Europe and into North America. He wasn't the man on the ground or the one orchestrating every detail, but his signature on orders, his silent approval, made him the orchestrator behind countless covert operations. Petrov had made a name for himself not through dedication to intelligence, but through his ability to profit off corruption while maintaining Moscow's ironclad approval. His immunity was absolute, protected by his loyalty to Moscow's broader agenda. Pavel learned that Petrov's lifestyle was far from the image of a dedicated civil servant. While officially he was a modest public servant, his real life painted a vastly different picture. Petrov owned a luxurious villa just outside of Moscow, a sprawling estate with private gardens, security guards, and lavish amenities that rivaled the homes of Russia's wealthiest oligarchs. The villa was more than just a home. It was a fortress, equipped with state-of-the-art security systems, its walls lined with imported marble, and its rooms filled with rare artwork, sculptures, and custom furniture. His estate wasn't just a symbol of wealth, it was a testament to his power, a quiet declaration that Colonel Petrov was untouchable. Inside this opulent home, Petrov hosted exclusive gatherings, attended by other high-ranking FSB officials, oligarchs, and influential politicians. These gatherings were more than social events. They were power meetings, moments when Moscow's most influential figures exchanged information, forged alliances, and solidified their grip over the FSB's operations. Guests dined on imported delicacies and drank the finest wines, their discussions veiled in secrecy. To those on the outside, these gatherings were untouchable, shielded by Moscow's protection and Petrov's unwavering influence. Colonel Petrov's wealth extended beyond his estate. Pavel uncovered accounts in foreign banks, secret stashes in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and even Dubai, where Petrov funneled millions generated from trafficking operations. His assets included luxury cars, private access to high-end resorts, and even shares in European businesses run by Moscow-friendly oligarchs. Through these investments, Petrov safeguarded his wealth and ensured that his influence extended into the international financial market. His position allowed him to exploit Moscow's global networks, operating with a freedom that bordered on arrogance. And Petrov wasn't the only one. Pavel learned about Lieutenant General Viktor Lebedev, a high-ranking FSB official who oversaw operations related to drug and human trafficking networks. Known for his brutality and unyielding loyalty to the state, Lebedev had earned a reputation as a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his objectives. Yet behind his ruthless exterior, Lebedev enjoyed an extravagant lifestyle rivaling the wealthiest businessmen in Russia. He owned multiple properties across Moscow, including a private penthouse in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the capital. Lebedev was known to frequent Moscow's most luxurious clubs and restaurants, where he was treated as royalty. He would arrive with an entourage of FSB security, ensuring his privacy and reinforcing his image as an untouchable figure within Russia's intelligence community. It was common knowledge that Lebedev had a taste for luxury cars, particularly high-end European models that cost as much as most Russians made in a decade. His fleet included vehicles that were specially modified with advanced security features, a show of wealth and power for a man who operated above the law. Like Petrov, Lebedev's influence was built on his connections. He maintained relationships with key figures in organized crime, allowing him to profit from smuggling operations while maintaining plausible deniability. Lebedev's inner circle included businessmen, politicians, and even members of law enforcement who ensured his operations remained unchallenged. For those in his circle, his loyalty and protection were invaluable. But for those who opposed him, his power was a reminder of Moscow's indifference to justice. No matter the extent of his crimes, Lebedev remained untouchable, his luxurious lifestyle funded by the very corruption he was supposed to fight. This immunity wasn't limited to Petrov and Lebedev. Across the upper echelons of the FSB, there were men like Major General Yuri Orlov, who managed to leverage his position within the agency's financial division to amass a fortune of his own. Orlov had perfected the art of diverting funds, skimming from budgets allocated to intelligence projects, and redirecting resources to his own accounts. He had ties to European and Middle Eastern banks, enabling him to hide his wealth far beyond Russia's borders. Orlov's impunity was guaranteed by his value to Moscow. He was the man who could make money disappear, laundering it through international channels that few would dare to trace. Orlov's wealth was visible in the private gatherings he hosted for other FSB elite. His guests were treated to exclusive performances by well-known artists, and his homes were filled with luxury goods from around the world, from rare wines and caviar to the finest silk drapes and handcrafted furnishings. Every aspect of Orlov's life was a testament to the unchecked power he held. He lived a life of indulgence, secure in the knowledge that his actions would go unpunished. Pavel's realization about these high-ranking officials was both infuriating and disheartening. The corruption wasn't a hidden cancer within the FSB. It was openly acknowledged, almost celebrated by the agency's elite. These men weren't hiding their wealth or influence. They flaunted it, confident that Moscow's protection would shield them from any consequences. Their opulent lifestyles were financed by the suffering of countless people caught in the FSB's operations. Each lavish home, luxury car, and exclusive gathering was built on the backs of those who had fallen victim to trafficking, extortion, and violence. For Pavel, the most astonishing aspect was the sheer arrogance of these officials. They were the faces of Moscow's power, and yet they operated with a freedom that defied accountability, insulated from criticism by the very agency they served. The FSB protected its own, ensuring that no inquiry, no investigation, no question would ever threaten the privileges of its upper ranks. To them, loyalty to Moscow was currency, and as long as they served its interests, they were invincible. Colonel Petrov, General Lebedev, Major General Orlov, they weren't merely part of the FSB. They were its embodiment, men who wielded influence like a weapon, untouchable in their privilege. Their immunity was guaranteed by Moscow's silent approval, a pact that allowed them to profit from corruption, trafficking, and exploitation without ever facing consequences. They lived above the law, above morality, secure in the knowledge that their loyalty to Moscow granted them immunity from judgment. Pavel's anger grew as he uncovered more details of their lives. These men held immense power, yet they operated with a moral void, viewing people not as citizens to protect, but as resources to exploit. Their power was boundless, unchecked, and it was a reminder of the corrupt heart beating within Moscow's shadowy empire. For Pavel, understanding this was a turning point. He realized that the FSB wasn't merely corrupt. It was an institution built on corruption, a system where the pursuit of power eclipsed any semblance of justice or honor. In the FSB's upper ranks, morality was an inconvenience, and justice was a myth. Loyalty to Moscow was all that mattered, and for that loyalty, these men were rewarded with wealth, protection, and the freedom to operate above the law. They weren't just untouchable, they were the embodiment of Moscow's unchecked power, a reminder that within Russia's intelligence community, corruption wasn't a flaw, it was the foundation. As Pavel continued to peel back the layers of the FSB's empire, he began to see a disturbing pattern emerge. At first, he had assumed that the agency's involvement in drug trafficking, corruption, and money laundering was driven solely by profit. But the deeper he delved, the more he realized that these activities were only pieces of a much larger puzzle. The FSB's motives went beyond money or influence. They were rooted in a vision, an agenda that extended far beyond Russia's borders. Moscow had set its sights on a grander goal, destabilizing the West and expanding Russian influence through an intricate web of operations that infiltrated nearly every sector of society. Pavel came to understand that the FSB viewed criminal activity not as an end, but as a means, a way to fund and facilitate a larger mission. Drug trafficking was more than a source of income. It was a tool to spread disorder, a way to weaken the fabric of Western societies from within. By flooding North American cities with narcotics, the FSB not only generated revenue but also contributed to a cycle of addiction, crime, and instability. For Moscow, this was more than profitable. It was strategic. The social chaos created by these operations softened the very foundations of Western communities, creating distractions and divisions that Moscow could exploit in pursuit of its ultimate objectives. The FSB's operations extended beyond drugs and corruption. Moscow had invested heavily in the infiltration of Western financial systems, using laundering schemes and covert investments to manipulate markets, influence economic trends, and even destabilize targeted industries. The FSB funneled millions into shell companies, offshore accounts, and shadowy investment groups that could buy shares in critical sectors, from energy and technology to media and real estate. The objective wasn't simply to make money. It was to gain influence over companies and industries that held sway over the Western economy. By embedding itself into the financial heart of the West, Moscow could pull strings from behind the scenes, affecting policies, influencing leaders, and securing leverage that was invisible but incredibly powerful. Pavel began to see that every piece of the FSB's network served a dual purpose. Each crime committed, each dollar laundered, each relationship cultivated was part of a carefully calculated strategy designed to undermine the West from within. The FSB wasn't just interested in weakening governments. It was interested in reshaping societies, planting seeds of discontent, and exploiting every crack in the Western system. This wasn't a conventional battle fought with weapons or armies. It was an ideological war waged in boardrooms, neighborhoods, and government offices, a slow but steady erosion of Western stability. At the heart of this strategy was an ambition that stretched far beyond economic gain or territorial expansion. The FSB sought to secure Russia's place as a dominant global power by manipulating, controlling, and, if necessary, destabilizing the very institutions that defined Western democracy. The agency aimed to build a world where Moscow's influence extended invisibly but pervasively, a world where critical decisions, policies, and even elections could be subtly shaped by Moscow's unseen hand. It was a vision of silent control, one that didn't require conquest or occupation, but rather a quiet dominance woven into the systems of foreign nations. Pavel found himself horrified yet captivated by the FSB's long-term vision. Unlike traditional intelligence agencies, which often focused on gathering information, the FSB was in the business of reshaping realities. Their agents weren't just spies. They were architects of influence, builders of a new world order where Moscow would hold sway over international dynamics, free from the restrictions of borders or laws. To the FSB, North America was more than a continent. It was fertile ground, a place where Moscow could plant the seeds of control, nurturing them over time until they blossomed into a subtle but pervasive authority. And now, Pavel realized, the FSB was poised to take its ambitions to an unprecedented level. The agency's leaders had identified a new frontier in their mission to destabilize the West, the infiltration of North American intelligence agencies themselves. This was no longer about manipulating gangs, bribing officials, or establishing financial footholds. It was about gaining direct access to the most sensitive data, operations, and personnel within North America's security infrastructure. If successful, this infiltration would grant Moscow unparalleled insights into the very systems that were supposed to protect the US and Canada from foreign threats. Pavel learned of a chilling plan that was quietly underway, one that would see FSB operatives embedded deep within agencies like the CIA, FBI, and Canada's CSIS. The FSB's elite operatives, disguised as everyday professionals, had been groomed for years, some even decades, with identities and backstories meticulously crafted to withstand the scrutiny of top-tier background checks. These agents would enter intelligence agencies not as moles or spies, but as fully integrated assets, seamlessly blending into the institutional culture, all the while feeding Moscow critical intelligence on North American security policies, counter-espionage efforts, and internal vulnerabilities. Pavel was struck by the ambition and patience that this plan required. Moscow was willing to wait, to invest years in grooming agents who could infiltrate North America's most trusted institutions. The FSB's leadership understood that this was a long game, one that required an unwavering commitment to subtlety and control. Their operatives were prepared to become fixtures within these agencies, rising through the ranks, building reputations, and establishing networks that Moscow could leverage at any moment. For the FSB, this was the ultimate conquest, a way to wield control over North America's most powerful institutions from within. The FSB's target wasn't just intelligence, it was trust. They aimed to sow doubt within North America's institutions, creating cracks in the very foundations of public faith. By infiltrating these agencies, Moscow would gain more than intelligence. It would gain influence over the flow of information, the direction of policies, and even the internal perceptions of threats. It would be an invisible manipulation, so deeply embedded that it would remain undetected until it was too late. Moscow's hand would shape the security landscape of the West, ensuring that critical decisions would always factor in Russian interests, whether overtly or subconsciously. For Pavel, this revelation was almost incomprehensible. The sheer scale and sophistication of Moscow's plan to infiltrate North American intelligence was both brilliant and terrifying. He realized that the FSB's operations weren't isolated incidents, they were interconnected, each element of corruption, trafficking, and infiltration feeding into a larger mission. Every compromised official, every criminal alliance, every dollar laundered served a single, unified purpose: to create a world where Moscow's influence was woven into the very fabric of North American society. In his mind, Pavel could see the pieces falling into place, a web stretching across continents, linking criminals, officials, businesses, and now, potentially, the very people tasked with protecting North America's security. The FSB's ultimate goal was no longer a matter of speculation. It was a clear, undeniable reality. They were building a silent empire, one that extended beyond Russian borders and planted itself within the infrastructure of the West. This was no longer espionage. It was an infiltration of democracy itself, a reshaping of power that defied the conventions of warfare. Pavel couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that settled over him. The FSB's grand plan was nearing its final stages, and its success would mark a turning point in history. Moscow was positioning itself to control information, influence policies, and exert control in a way that the world had never seen before. This wasn't a clash of armies or ideologies. It was a silent takeover, a redefinition of influence, where Moscow's presence would be felt in every decision, every policy, every action taken by North America's most powerful institutions. And now, As he uncovered the final pieces of this agenda, Pavel realized that he was staring into the face of a new kind of threat. A threat that wasn't fought with weapons or soldiers, but with influence, subtlety, and the gradual erosion of trust. He understood that the FSB's operations, from trafficking to financial manipulation to political infiltration, were all strands of a single, massive operation designed to shift the balance of global power. The FSB's ultimate goal was no longer hidden. It was a carefully constructed reality, one that would reshape the West in Moscow's image, leaving North America vulnerable and unsuspecting. A stage set for a final move. As Pavel prepared himself for what lay ahead, he knew that the FSB's plans were only beginning to unfold. The true extent of their ambition was yet to be revealed, but the pieces were already in motion. The next phase would be the most dangerous, the most audacious, and the most consequential. Moscow had crossed a line that could not be undone, and the world was about to witness the true power of a nation that operated in the shadows, controlling societies from within, one compromised agent at a time. Pavel had seen the FSB's reach across continents, from criminal networks to government offices, from financial markets to neighborhood communities. But nothing he had uncovered prepared him for the revelation that was yet to come. Moscow's ambitions didn't stop at destabilizing the West from the outside. They were working to infiltrate the very heart of North America's intelligence agencies. The CIA, FBI, and Canada's CSIS, agencies responsible for national security and protecting against foreign threats, had become targets in the FSB's master plan. And, as Pavel learned, Moscow had succeeded in penetrating these institutions in ways that went far beyond anyone's worst fears. The FSB's approach was patient, deliberate, and layered with complexity. Unlike the typical tactics of espionage that rely on recruitment through ideology or coercion, the FSB used a variety of methods to infiltrate these agencies, methods that exploited the unique vulnerabilities of each institution. For the CIA, the FSB focused on strategic recruitment, embedding operatives in academic programs and think tanks that served as pipelines to government service. For the FBI, they leveraged criminal networks, using known gang associates or family connections to position individuals close to bureau officials. And in Canada, with CSIS, the FSB utilized subtle bribery, offering incentives that were hard to trace but difficult to resist. One particularly unsettling case involves an FSB operative known as Mikhail, who had spent years cultivating his background, establishing himself as an academic expert on international relations. Mikhail had been trained in Moscow, where he learned not only intelligence tradecraft, but also how to craft a public profile that would appeal to Western institutions. Under his assumed identity, Mikhail completed advanced degrees in prestigious European universities, published articles, and built a network of respected colleagues who saw him as a rising expert on Eastern European affairs. When he applied to work at a Washington-based think tank, his credentials made him a perfect candidate, and he was quickly accepted. Over time, Mikhail's think tank position allowed him to cultivate contacts within the CIA, particularly among analysts who specialized in Russia and Eastern Europe. He became a trusted figure in intelligence circles, someone who was frequently invited to private discussions and policy briefings. What few realized was that Mikhail was funneling this information directly back to the FSB. He provided Moscow with valuable insights into the CIA's perception of Russian activities, upcoming American intelligence priorities, and even shared details about key personnel within the agency. For the FSB, Mikhail was a goldmine, a seemingly harmless academic whose connections granted Moscow unparalleled access to the CIA's internal culture and strategies. The FBI's vulnerability was different, and the FSB tailored its approach accordingly. In this case, Moscow leveraged its existing alliances with organized crime, utilizing criminal networks as a bridge to those within the bureau who were susceptible to bribery, intimidation, or manipulation. In one case, an FSB operative operating under the alias Yuri had positioned himself within a New York-based criminal network with direct connections to low-level FBI informants. Yuri was skilled at establishing rapport with these informants, presenting himself as a figure who could offer protection and resources in exchange for cooperation. Gradually, Yuri's influence grew, and he managed to gain access to confidential information on FBI operations targeting organized crime. When an informant within the Bureau unknowingly passed along sensitive details about an investigation into Russian gang activity, Yuri relayed this intelligence back to Moscow. The FSB used this information to protect their assets, altering operations, moving key individuals, and ensuring that American law enforcement efforts were constantly a step behind. The Bureau, unaware that the FSB had compromised their informants, continued their investigations without realizing that they were being outmaneuvered by an invisible hand. Canada's intelligence agency, CSIS, presented another unique vulnerability. The FSB exploited Canada's openness to foreign professionals and immigrants, placing operatives who posed as consultants, international business people, or experts in fields like cybersecurity. One of these operatives, known as Natalia, had positioned herself as a cyber consultant who frequently worked with Canadian businesses and, occasionally, with government agencies. Through her professional role, Natalia cultivated relationships with mid-level officials in CSIS, establishing herself as a trustworthy advisor with insights into Russia's cyber capabilities. Natalia's position allowed her to provide Moscow with valuable data on Canadian cybersecurity measures, particularly within critical infrastructure sectors like energy and transportation. In exchange for her insights, the FSB rewarded her contacts with financial incentives that were nearly impossible to trace: luxury vacations, offshore accounts, and untraceable digital currency transfers. Over time, these officials became reliant on Natalia's information and the FSB's financial incentives, transforming CSIS from an intelligence agency into an unwitting collaborator in Moscow's schemes. What was supposed to be a line of defense against foreign threats had been turned into a channel of influence that flowed directly to Moscow. In another chilling instance, an FSB-affiliated contract infiltrated a US military project as part of a wider operation to collect data on American defense capabilities. Known only by his alias Ivan, this contractor worked as a low-level technician, carefully navigating the security protocols and restricted access of his role. Ivan's modest position was intentional. By staying low profile, he avoided the intense scrutiny applied to higher-ranking officials. His role granted him access to classified systems, and he used this access to gather intelligence on troop deployments, communication protocols, and even surveillance technologies. The FSB used this intelligence to adjust their own defense strategies and anticipate American maneuvers, a strategic advantage that granted Moscow an edge in its global positioning. These cases weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a calculated effort to breach North America's most critical intelligence agency. The FSB exploited every possible weakness, every avenue of vulnerability, from financial greed and personal connections to professional ambition. Through this multi-layered infiltration, Moscow had managed to gain unprecedented access to North American intelligence, a pipeline of information that Moscow could use to further its own interests, while undermining its Western adversaries from within. What made these operations even more shocking was their sophistication. The FSB didn't simply plant spies within these agencies. They built entire networks, carefully linking agents, collaborators, and informants into a web of influence that operated with stealth and precision. They recruited individuals who could pass even the most rigorous security checks, embedding them in ways that defied traditional detection methods. To the CIA, FBI, and CSIS, these individuals appeared as professionals, advisors, and support staff. But to Moscow, they were the front line in a silent war, one fought not with weapons, but with information, influence, and control. Pavel realized that the FSB's tactics had achieved something previously thought impossible. They had blurred the line between allies and adversaries, creating a scenario where trusted officials within North American agencies were unwittingly furthering Moscow's agenda. By embedding operatives within these agencies, the FSB ensured that critical information flowed directly to Moscow, undermining national security efforts at their very core. Every file accessed, every piece of intelligence leaked, every decision influenced marked a quiet victory for Moscow, a step closer to a world where Russian interests would hold sway over Western policy. For Pavel, the magnitude of the FSB's infiltration was staggering. The agency had not only succeeded in placing operatives within intelligence agencies, they had created a system of covert control that allowed them to shape decisions, misdirect efforts, and ultimately secure Moscow's dominance within critical sectors of North American security. These operatives weren't merely spies. They were embedded assets, allies of Moscow hidden in plain sight within institutions that were supposed to protect the United States and Canada from foreign threats. With this infiltration, the FSB could exert influence over the very decisions meant to counteract foreign interference. They could shape narratives, control the flow of intelligence, and steer policies in ways that benefited Moscow while weakening the West. The agencies that had been North America's line of defense were now compromised, manipulated, and, at times, unknowingly serving the interests of a foreign power. It was a breach that went beyond espionage. It was an act of subversion that struck at the heart of North American sovereignty. As Pavel uncovered the extent of the FSB's reach, he felt a profound sense of dread. This wasn't just infiltration, it was an invisible coup, a silent takeover that left no visible scars but inflicted a wound on the integrity of the intelligence community. North America's most trusted institutions were no longer bastions of security. They had become stages for Moscow's silent conquest, platforms from which Russian influence could be exercised with impunity. And as he pieced together the final elements of the FSB's infiltration, Pavel knew that Moscow's game had only just begun. The operatives embedded in the CIA, FBI, and CSIS were merely the first wave. With each day, each new layer of compromise, the FSB moved closer to its ultimate goal, the ability to control, from within, the intelligence agencies that were meant to protect the West. The silent invasion had begun, and with it, the future of North America's security hung in the balance. As Pavel pieced together the final elements of the FSB's strategy, a cold realization settled over him. This wasn't just an infiltration. This was a carefully orchestrated shift in global power, an invisible war waged in the heart of Western security institutions, with consequences that extended far beyond espionage. The FSB's operations weren't isolated attacks or opportunistic plays. They were a comprehensive assault on the foundations of North American and global security. And for the first time, Pavel understood the magnitude of what Moscow intended to achieve, a world where Russia could operate without opposition, its influence embedded in the very structures designed to resist it. The FSB's reach extended into North America's most critical infrastructure. Through years of covert operations, they had gained access to cybersecurity frameworks, electric grids, communication networks, and even transportation systems. The operatives embedded within the CIA, FBI, AFBI, and CSIS were gathering not just intelligence but also insights into the vulnerabilities of these essential systems. If Moscow chose to wield this knowledge as a weapon, the implications would be catastrophic. A coordinated attack could disable power grids, disrupt communication channels, or sabotage transportation systems, all without a single soldier setting foot on foreign soil. Pavel could envision the potential impact with frightening clarity. A single breach in the electric grid could plunge entire cities into darkness, leaving millions vulnerable and paralyzing the economy. A compromised communications network could disrupt the flow of critical information, isolating communities, and confusing emergency response efforts. These weren't hypothetical scenarios. They were risks that Moscow was fully prepared to exploit if it served their interests. With operatives stationed within North American intelligence agencies, Moscow held the keys to North America's safety, able to manipulate events in ways that would go undetected until it was too late. For North America, the danger wasn't just a matter of stolen secrets. It was a threat to the stability of everyday life. The FSB's operatives, by gaining access to classified information and infrastructure vulnerabilities, were positioned to destabilize the US and Canada from within. Moscow could influence everything from economic stability to public safety, triggering disruptions that would ripple through society. The FSB's ambitions had moved beyond intelligence gathering. They were now a silent, looming force that could compromise national stability, manipulating the West's security structures to serve Russian interests at a global scale. This threat wasn't limited to North America. The FSB's infiltration had broader implications for global security, impacting allies and partners who relied on North America's intelligence and stability. If Moscow could compromise the integrity of the CIA, FBI, and CSIS, then the allies who depended on North America's intelligence could also be at risk. Europe, Asia, and even parts of Africa were reliant on intelligence sharing, economic stability, and coordinated security efforts. The FSB's control over North American institutions would inevitably seep into these allied systems, creating a domino effect of compromised information and weakened defenses worldwide. Pavel knew that the implications were terrifying, but he was determined to reveal what he had learned. He believed that only by exposing the extent of Moscow's operations could the West begin to defend itself. In one of his final statements, Pavel warned of the complacency that had allowed this infiltration to go undetected. "We are dealing with an adversary that sees no boundaries, that respects no laws. The FSB has embedded itself into the very institutions designed to protect you, and they are using that influence to reshape the world in Moscow's image." His words carried the weight of someone who had witnessed the FSB's methods firsthand, someone who understood the agency's willingness to dismantle anything that stood in its way. Pavel spoke of the FSB's ultimate objective, not merely dominance, but control. A world where Moscow could manipulate events without direct intervention, orchestrating crises from afar and guiding nations into a future where Russian interests reigned supreme. "They don't need armies to conquer," Pavel said. They've weaponized influence, control, and silence. They're attacking the invisible foundations of security and trust. This is not a battle you can see, but it is one that affects every person who depends on the systems they've infiltrated. He emphasized that Moscow's tactics had evolved beyond traditional espionage. The FSB wasn't just gathering information, it was infiltrating the core of national security, positioning itself to destabilize from within, creating vulnerabilities in places most people would never suspect. As Pavel continued his warning, he left viewers with a stark understanding of the stakes. This is not just about intelligence or power, he said. This is about the future of our world, a future where Moscow's influence could dictate policies, shape economies, control the flow of information. This is not a hypothetical risk, it is a reality that is happening right now, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and denial. And unless the West wakes up to this threat, the FSB will succeed in reshaping the global order. Pavel's insights were not merely observations, they were a call to action. He urged viewers to recognize the reality of this new kind of warfare, a war fought without battles but with influence, leverage, and control. He spoke of the need for transparency, the urgency of reform within intelligence agencies, and the necessity of collaboration among allies. In his view, the only way to counter the FSB's infiltration was to unite against it, to recognize the shared risk and take steps to dismantle Moscow's hidden networks before they could strike at the heart of global security. For Pavel, the solution was clear but challenging. The West would need to reassess its vulnerabilities, improve its security protocols, and become vigilant against the type of subtle, insidious tactics that Moscow had mastered. He stressed the importance of digital security, the need for thorough background checks, and the imperative of scrutinizing every layer of government and law enforcement to root out compromised individuals. In his view, defending against the FSB's infiltration would require an overhaul of the very systems Moscow had exploited. As he concluded his warnings, Pavel's message was one of both urgency and hope. He believed that the West could still protect itself, that it could stand against this invisible threat if only it chose to act. His final words resonated as both a warning and a challenge. This is a new kind of war, one that requires new defenses. We must recognize that the FSB's methods are a reality, that their reach is vast, and that their ambitions are boundless. But we are not powerless. We can confront this threat, but we must be willing to see it, to name it, and to fight it before it's too late. Pavel's revelations left an indelible impact. For those who listened, the stakes became painfully clear. The FSB's infiltration wasn't just a threat to North America. It was a threat to the world. A systematic attack on the structures that held society together. As his words echoed, viewers were left with an unsettling understanding of the real-world impact of Moscow's hidden empire, a shadow that extended across continents, entwined in every system, waiting for the moment to reveal itself. The future remained uncertain, but Pavel's insights offered a path forward. His story underscored the stakes and the urgent need for action, a reminder that security and freedom required vigilance and courage in the face of unseen threats. As viewers absorbed his final words, they were left with the realization that the battle had already begun, and the outcome was in their hands.